Let's get started, everybody. Welcome to tonight's town hall. I'm really excited about it, but before we begin, just some housekeeping. Everyone's automatically muted, so you don't have to worry about that. And if you have a question, just please go ahead and text it, type it into the Q&A box. We may stop throughout the presentation to answer some questions, but if not, there is going to be some time left at the end to answer questions. And also keep an eye on the chat box, because we're going to be putting some links in there that will be links to some great resources that you could use in relationship to topic. And this is being recorded, so it'll be posted on our website within the next day or so. So with that, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Scott Giacoppo, and I am the Director of Municipal and Shelter Support here at Best Friends. My role is to primarily work with animal control officers around the country, but municipal shelters and municipal agencies around the country, and we go in and we work with them on implementing programs and help them increase their life saving. And one of the programs that we work with, in one of the training we offer, is community engagement and community outreach, which is kind of the central topic of what we're going to be talking tonight. And we're going to be talking with Kenny Lamberti. I'll let him introduce himself. We are doing it a little different tonight. Usually there's a panel and all these questions, but tonight is just a conversation between Kenny and I. And Kenny and I usually have these conversations, and we're always talking to each other to try and figure out how to meld our two worlds. And this is going to be one of those conversations that we want to share with you tonight. So I'm going to ask Kenny to join us and tell us a little bit about himself.
Hey, thanks, Scott. Hey, everyone. Excited to be here with y'all. I think I know likely quite a few people attending, and I think I'm excited to talk about this because I think it goes so far beyond community engagement, and that's really what my background is. I, like maybe some other people here, just happened into this wonderful world of animal welfare. I was a teacher, a school teacher in Boston, where I'm from, which you probably can tell that already. I was a social worker, and I did a lot of work around community organizing, around social issues, around poverty, voter equity, reproductive justice, LGBTQ rights, things like that. And it led me to animal welfare just because I love dogs and cats and saw the community angle. And that led me, I worked at a lot of different organizations, ultimately HSUS, where I was one of a small group of people that started a program called Pets for Life, ultimately became a vice president. And then that led me to Best Friends, where now I'm the director of Grassroots Advocacy. And my job really now, in the simplest form, is I want to work with my team to collect and gather as many people as we possibly can in as many communities, the most diverse and exclusive broad tent kind of network of people to plug in to both be part of our mission, but also alleviate the bandwidth. The one thing I think that's most relevant here is no one, no matter where you work, what shelter or rescue you work in, no one has enough time, enough staff, and enough money, right? So using the community to offset that can just increase the impact we have and help us save more lives, help more people, and kind of hopefully someday put us out of business. So that's kind of in a nutshell who I am and what I do.
Well, Kenny, I got to say, as a former animal control officer myself, that scares me. And I work with agencies all over the country who are afraid to work with the community for a multitude of reasons. And let's start looking into some of those reasons and the myths surrounding that, and how we can actually bridge those, those gaps and those misconceptions. Because one of the things, when I think of your team and what you guys are doing, and you guys are doing fantastic work out in the community, mobilizing the community to help and help solve problems and to be a part of the solution and to partner. A lot of animal control officers I deal with are reluctant, and when they hear the word advocate, they feel they automatically think of the people that go onto Facebook and trash them and call them names, and are saying, oh, they're not doing their job because they, this animal was left outside in the cold and they didn't take them. And, so I think that there in a lot of places, not every place, I get that, but in a lot of places that breakdown does exist. And what are your thoughts on, like, advocates and things like I just described? I mean, because that's a genuine concern with animal control officers.
Yeah, I think it's important to not dismiss the fear. Most fear comes from a place of reality, right? And I think sometimes it gets exaggerated into a point where it extends actual reality, right? But it starts from a realistic place. And I think to me, the biggest um, kind of key moment there is the proactive versus reactive, right? I think when we live and exist in a place of reactivity, whether you're an animal control officer, a shelter director, or whatever, or you executive director of a rescue, like if you're always kind of playing defense and waiting for your community to kind of have that gotcha moment or to point out something maybe you didn't do the way they would have liked, you're always reacting and versus being proactive. If we make priority, both in how we budget, how we create job descriptions, how we utilize our teams to proactively build really positive relationships within the communities we all work in, which we're all part of. No matter where we work, we are part of a community, just the same way a school is, the same way a YMCA is, a police force, animal control unit, a shelter, a rescue is part of a community. The more effort, time, and commitment of resources we put to building those relationships proactively, what happens is, because the truth is, no matter how good of a job we do, there's going to be people that don't like it. Especially with social media and Facebook and all that, there's always going to be people who are just more committed to complaining, right? And that's just the nature of the world we exist in currently, right? But what I tell people all the time is if you've got a strong army and contingent of people in the community who are your supporters, who love what you do, who are part of your effort, who see you in the community every day, who see you being plugged in, they will be your greatest defense to the smaller group of outliers who are more committed to complaining. So it's the proactive work, in my opinion, and the real commitment of time, energy, resources, and bandwidth to building that relationship that builds a force field around you to protect you when the inevitable complainers show up. They will never not be there. This is anyone on the call listening knows there will always be people who have a problem with what we do, especially when you're in the enforcement angle of this. And to me, for every 2 people like that, there's 100 people out there that we can bring into the fold and engage in a positive way.
Right.
And
that want to be part of the solution.
that's the key.
They
Yeah.
want to be part of the solution. And that's right. And, and you bring up a good point, Kenny, when you talk about enforcement, and in the example I used, someone's angry that the animal control officer didn't take the animal that was left outside. One of the things I've found is that a lot of people in the community don't realize that animal control officers are actually, when they're doing their job, they're actually acting under the color of law. And when they're doing, like, particularly the enforcement section of it, and that they're bound by things such as, I don't know, the Constitution of the United States, so they can't go in and just take an animal away from someone, because under law, that's generally considered someone's property. And yeah, I get that there are laws protecting the animals from harm and all that. But when an animal control officer sees something happening, they still have to abide by all of the constitutional laws, the state laws of search and seizure. And a lot of people get upset with officers for not taking that animal when they think something bad is happening. I remember when I was an officer, and Kenny, you're a Boston boy, I'm a Boston boy. We're both, we've known each other for years. And this is something that, we've been working together on for years, but I remember, times when animal control officers were so afraid of working with the community that they totally shut down and didn't want to have anything to do with them because of situations like that, where they didn't take the opportunity to talk to members of the public and to educate them and inform them of what they can and can't do. And that includes what the laws are. Just because there's a dog outside and he's got a dog house and he's chained to a dog house, in most places, as long as it's an adequate dog house, that's not illegal. And there's nothing that can be done, even though the officer themselves hates that.
Yeah.
And this is something that we've been struggling with for years.
Yeah, I think something that I think we probably all can agree on is that although the majority of people are doing their best and most people are good and don't want to do animals harm, there are bad actors. And some of those bad actors are intentional about their bad actions. Many more of the people are keeping their pets in less than ideal situations because of a lack of resources and information, right? And I think that's where creating that line of that delineation between the difference and respecting the fact that I can't imagine. I know for me, I'm so grateful that there's people like you, Scott, to do the work I don't want to do. The work most of us don't want to have to be the enforcer, the person that goes in and has to bring the bad news to people. No one, very rarely does an animal control officer or a cop in any fashion be the deliverer of good news, right? They're there because something's wrong, right? And I think that delineation between like what's intentional kind of cruelty and neglect and what's kind of a lack of information or resources is where most of us come in, right? And the better relationship we have with the community, the better relationship we have even with each other, shelter to shelter, rescue to rescue, community to community, we can then decide, okay, with some maybe ability to help fix a hole in a fence or provide vaccines or spay and neuter, whatever is maybe missing from the equation, when we can connect people who want to do the right thing to that, it makes everyone's life easier. It makes the enforcement angles arm easier because now you don't have to be the bad guy or right in that scenario. And now that pet gets to stay in a home. So now the financial burden, the care burden of the animal doesn't fall on the shelter or rescue. So it's a win-win for everyone. But the starting point of that is we have to have people in the community building relationships. Again, it all comes back to that. Without the relationship in the community, none of what I just described is possible. And then we end up in a place where our options are take the pet away. Now that costs the shelter and rescue money, time, and resources, right? And now we've lost the ability to have an ally in the community. So to me, again, it always comes back to, are we willing to make the effort? You hear a lot of talk now around community-centered sheltering, and there's lots of groups working on this kind of what's the future going to look like. And, I'm one who's prone to challenge myself and the rest of us, my colleagues, in this effort. Are we really, right? I think of all the things that are important. Transport's important. Foster homes are important. They're incredibly important pieces of the puzzle, right? But those things are still taking pets out of the families they're in and putting them somewhere else, right? Maybe not a shelter, but they're going somewhere else, right? So to me, we're still chugging towards this place where the solutions lie in the community with the people more so. And the burden of all this work doesn't have to lay on the hands of everyone on this call. It's been the truth for far too long. We've absorbed the burden of everything that has to be done for dogs and cats. And it's just not tenable. It was never tenable. And I think we're chugging towards a place where we can share the burden with local communities.
Yeah, and this stuff isn't new. I mean, I know plenty of officers out there who have been promoting the community engagement, the community policing philosophy for years. Now it's becoming okay to do. When you said, you're glad there's people that can do the enforcement, I laughed a little bit because I almost had you as an enforcement officer back in the mid 90s. I almost got you on the team.
A funny anecdote for some, like Scott said, we're both in Boston and we're both older than 50 at this point. And in the early 90s, I was a school teacher and I was wanting a change, and I interviewed, I actually got offered the job ultimately to become a law enforcement officer with the MSPCA in Boston. And Scott was the person I went into the field with. That's how we met. And we drove around and he shared with me what the profession was about. And to be frank, I was blown away because I thought in my mind, I was envisioning cops like the show, Bad Boy. I thought I was going to go out and crack heads because I loved animals. That's what in my brain as a much younger, less informed person thought I was going to do. And Scott had me driving around, teaching people how to walk their dog on a leash, working with a lumber company to find wood to help someone build a doghouse. And that's not at all what I thought the profession was. And come to find out now, after being in the profession and being in a leadership role in the profession now for years, that, almost 30 years later, now we're still having conversations about that evolution. But, that's what Scott was showing me what the profession was in the early 90s, and I had no idea. And I think we're still have a long way to go, but you know,
But I think now, Kenny, if let me interrupt for a second. I think now it's more okay, because back then people would look at me, other officers would look at me like, oh, he's the tree hugger, or blah, 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 blah. You know, they'd speak negatively about the work that I was doing. And I was definitely the minority in officers. And I know, and it wasn't just me. I know, Todd, you know, give props to Todd Stousey out in Santa Cruz, California. He's been preaching this since the 90s as well. You know, so I'm in Boston, he's in California, and everything in the middle. There were those pockets of officers that were preaching that and doing that. But now I think it's becoming more and more acceptable, and there's less and less of those officers that are complaining about it or thinking poorly about it. And you know, and they're being highlighted. Those efforts are being highlighted. Like I got a guy who works on my team, Nick Walton, who was an officer in Fulton County, Georgia. And one of my favorite stories he tells is when he went to a house, and under most circumstances, officers would have seized all these dogs from this guy. And he saw a couple of guys just playing poker on the side, on the corner, which is typical in a lot of urban areas. They're playing dominoes or cards or something. And Nick just said, hey, do you know who owns them? Long story short, they called the guy and said, yeah, this guy, you know, wants to talk to you about his dogs. While the guy was waiting, Nick sat down and played cards with them, and he built up the relationship. He built up the relationship to a point where when the guy showed up, they said, yeah, you can trust him. He's a good guy. And that's one of the benefits for officers in particular, to building those community relationships, is that cooperation with the alleged bad guy. You know what I mean? Because they're not bad guys. Like you said, you know, this guy in particular had a bunch of dogs, and under normal circumstances, an officer would probably have impounded all the dogs. But Nick was there. Nick was not of that mindset. And it is a philosophy. It is a mindset. He was able to provide those resources to get the dogs, to improve the lives of those dogs and keep them in the home where they belong, because it was a resource problem. It wasn't a care problem. It wasn't an attitude towards the animals problem. It wasn't a cultural problem that, you know, this type of person doesn't like animals as much as this type of person, which we hear a lot. It was, this person didn't have the same resources as someone else. And this guy loved his animals. And we've been, and that's one of the key things we find out there, is that, you know, it's not that, you know, people don't want to fix their fence, or people don't want to walk their dog on a leash. It's, they don't have the resources. It's, you know, just helping someone fix a fence to prevent a dog from getting out. And officers tell me, well, that's not my responsibility. And I always say to them, it's not your responsibility, but it's your problem, because you're going to keep going out there to pick up that stray dog, which you shouldn't anyway, but that's another story. And it should be your responsibility to help someone who cares about animals. And that's the way I view an officer in the street, as someone who is there to help solve problems.
Yeah, and I think it's what you said about the philosophy. It goes so much further than the animal control arm of this, right? Or the enforcement arm of this, because the same thing applies to our adoption programs. Or we have, you know, for years I would hear things like, well, we have a spay neuter fund, but like the certain communities aren't taking advantage of it. And I would always flip the conversation. I said, well, that's one way to look at it. Or we could look at it as, we have a spay neuter fund, and we are struggling to get those resources in the hands of the people in communities who need it most, right? Like, and the mindset of why people are or aren't doing certain things as it relates to their pets. If we flip that and invert that as to what we're doing or not doing, because we have control over so much of these dynamics, but for a long time it was, why don't people spay neuter, right? We've kind of, I don't want to say solved, but we've done a really good job with that, right? Adoption, like, we've done a really good job with that. We still have a long way to go, and both are still very important. But I think looking at ourselves first as an industry first, and thinking of how do we have the greatest impact with our resources? And resources are not just money. We tend to think of it that way, but it's also information. It's also our staff. It's our best, who are our most outgoing employees. And it's also, how do we turn people, because that word advocate, I'm under no illusion that that scares people, right?
Yeah.
Right now, we've got 16,000 advocates representing all 50 states across the country, which I'm incredibly proud of. We built that program in less than a year. And these are all everyday people who just raised their hand and said, I want to be part of the solution. And we're putting them in a million different ways, everywhere from getting involved in legislation as it relates to community cats or breed discriminatory legislation, where some of them are building, trying to ramp up foster programs or transport of volunteers, or amplifying messaging, getting information in the hands of people who need it the most, et cetera, et cetera. But there is still that kind of uncomfortable feeling around advocates. And I think that that's on us, right? Like it's on our industry to invert this, because I think of it like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I know you've had a very good close friend and colleague of mine, James Evans from CARE, on these network before. And I always say this, having a DEI program won't solve any of your problems, because it's not something that can be solved with a program, right? It has to be something that leadership, I know there's lots of leaders on the call today, leadership, attitude reflects leadership, right? And if leadership is seeing people as an asset, if leadership sees the community as something that we're going to be commit and make an investment in, then it trickles down to all phases of your organization. And then you truly become a holistic effort where the community is a partner. The community aren't just people who need help or people who can help, they're a partner. The community is a true partner, just like a vet clinic, a spay neuter clinic is a partner, or et cetera, et cetera. The community, in many ways, is our most valuable partner. I'm not sure we've utilized them to the full extent of their capabilities.
But I think history has shown a lot of, especially municipal agencies, that can be a scary thing. And I'll give you a perfect example. A friend of mine runs a shelter outside of Boston, and he has very limited staff. Okay, and he can barely do adoptions. He's got animal control officers that both clean and care for the animals, and then also respond to calls. Right, so their adoptions are limited, and he relies very heavily on the local rescue groups to pull animals from him and place them up for adoption. He came to me with a concern one day that every time one of these rescue groups pull an animal from the animal control unit, which he totally appreciates, they would go on and advertise that animal on Facebook saying, we just rescued this dog from death row. The blank animal control officer's death row, help us get this animal a new home. And he's like, I don't want the public seeing that message that my building is death row. It's not. I'm doing everything I can to make it so I don't have to euthanize an animal. But now this is helping people with a negative stigma towards the work that I do. I don't want to not work with them, but I can't have this happen anymore. And we see that all over the place. I mean, and there's no way around it. When you go online, you see that. So I ended up sitting down with him and the rescue group, and it was totally unintentional by them. They loved the relationship. They loved the work he was doing. They didn't mean it in a negative way. So all we had to do was get them to change their verbiage on their post to say, in partnership with the animal control department, we are able to offer this animal an alternative to the shelter. Please help us, please adopt this animal so that we can offer another animal a place in our foster network. And that's all it took, was just that communication. And I think we don't communicate often enough between the municipal agencies and the advocates. Because there are negative advocates out there, and there are people, and like you said earlier, there's always going to be that group. No matter what you do, it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So do the right thing, do what you can, and don't hold back, because no matter what you do, someone's going to complain about it.
Yeah, and you can only control what you can control, right?
Exactly.
A really great comms director once told me that her primary job is to craft messaging that resonates with the largest audience, and that a very small component of her job was creating responses to any component of that audience, right? And I think that really resonated with me, because I think of like what words do we choose to use when we talk about our community or about the work we do, our organization, et cetera, et cetera. We're not up, the world isn't actually Facebook, right? So like, you don't have to respond to a post. You don't have to respond to a comment. We feel like we do, right? Because we're so worried that someone else is gonna tell our story or create a narrative about us. But if we are intentional, I would challenge, I'm sure any executive director on this call or shelter director or ops person, anyone in leadership, I would challenge you to do an audit and say, do I have a staff person whose full-time job is to craft our narrative and build relationships in the community? Or are different people trying to piece it together here and there? I would look at my budget, no matter if it's a huge budget or a small budget, and say, how much money am I allocating to both telling our story and building relationships in the community? Because in effect, we get what we put into it. If we have no one, that's no one's job, and we're not allocating any of our resources to it, we're not going to get much return on the investment. But if we do have someone who's mindful, who says, hey, everything I type, everything I post needs to resonate with the largest audience in my community possible, not just the choir, not just the people who love us, and maybe more importantly, not just the people who might antagonize us, the largest audience. Like, how much time are we get? Because I think it's great to talk about these things philosophically, and we could have a stream of consciousness conversation all hour. But at the end of the day, I feel a responsibility to give people tangible, doable things. And I would challenge all of us to take stock of our programs, take stock of our organizations, and say, how much time, how much staff, how much money am I allocating to both relationship building and telling our story? And if you dedicate an ample amount of time, I know it can be scary because you may have to say, I need one less adoption counselor now, or one less kind of enforcement staff now. But the return on investment will be huge. But it's a shift we have to make. So I think that's how we move. If people ask what is the future and whatnot, the future is how we tell our story and where we allocate our resource, our time, and our energy. And I think if we do it more in the community, that's true community support or community center, whatever word we want to use, sheltering. Like, it's not, if we have no money and no time dedicated in the community, then it's kind of just words.
Yeah, and what we want to do is talk about how the animal control function of a municipality and the community can work together to achieve that. And it brings up a point. There's a couple of questions that were asked that I want to touch on one right now, and it's basically, what would you recommend to a rescue or community activist to build those relationships with animal control? And one of the things that, and that also, let me back up a little bit, that also plays to one of the other questions that were asked relating to how do animal control officers go the other way. So we had one person ask, how does the community build a relationship with the animal control, and how does animal control build a relationship with the community? So one of the things that that stands out in my mind that I definitely wanted to touch on at some point tonight was, when an animal control officer is out doing their job, the only time the city hall or supervisors get a call is when something bad happens, right? And I want to point out, like, community cap programs in particular, right? So anytime a community cap program is implemented in a community, someone calls City Hall and starts complaining about these cats that are roaming around in the yards, right? When I ran animal control in DC, we started getting the caregivers and the people who we wanted to interact with in a positive way to call City Hall and thank them for allowing us to do this program. And getting those callers to call in really flipped the numbers of calls that were coming in. What am I looking for? The ratio between negative and positive. We started getting more positives. And when an elected official thinks of a call as just a vote, so more people were calling saying, hey, thank you for doing this program. Animal control is doing a great job. Let them do what they're doing. Then there were people calling saying, take these damn cats out of my yard. So we got the support of the city council because of that. And that really helped us build a relationship and look at the community in a different light. And the same thing, I remember when it was time for a budget allocation. I was in a budget meeting and I got my notes and I'm about to go up and testify before city council on, why we need more money. And they always allow the public to speak beforehand, before the government officials speak. And lo and behold, people were getting up, members of the public getting up and praising us and saying they're doing a great job. They could be doing better if they only had more money. So city council, I'm asking you to allocate more money into their annual budget. And I mean, talk about, me coming out of there, like, you're my new best friend, buddy, So it's things like that we can do, residents and advocates and so forth can help animal control with the city government in getting legislation passed, getting budget. That's one key step that's going to help people say, wow, I like these people. And also, when you are going on to social media, think about the impact about what you're about to post might have on that agency. Is it really going to change their behavior? If they did something you don't like, rather than going public, because it's probably not going to change their behavior as much as it is going to alienate you from them, as opposed to just calling and saying, hey, what happened here? Or trying to follow up on a more personal, not going public with that stuff really helps. And I know there's a whole lot of other things, like there's a group out of Florida, Pasco Humane, that actually has a volunteer program for animal control. And I know, like, I think Charlotte Mecklenburg does it as well, but it's to me, it's the first and only full-fledged volunteer program for animal control, where members of the public can come in and help animal control with administrative duties, right? Pulling up to see if there was past complaints on this place, or, there's a whole slew of things they're doing. And one of the things that they're doing is, or they're looking to do, I'm not sure if I'm not going to speak out of turn. I don't know if they're actually doing it yet, but one of the things I know they were doing was if they had a series of houses, let's say that they needed to do rechecks on, like doing a recheck is a big part of an animal control officer's job. I go out and I'm talking to you, Kenny. I'm like, hey, Kenny, that doghouse is it needs repairs, or you can't leave the dog out in the rain, or whatever it might be. I now have to come back 5 days later or however long, and then I have to do a couple of rechecks to make sure you're in compliance with the law. These people are doing that. And one of the best things that I've seen out of that, as well as a lot of this new community, well, I don't want to call it new, but the community-based sheltering movement, so to speak, is having residents find stray dogs and bring them home, and not have to involve animal control at all. Like if you find a dog roaming your neighborhood, chances are that dog. Studies show, Dallas, Texas just did a fantastic study on stray dogs and where they come from. They're found within I think it was 72% of them were found a mile from their home. And Dallas takes in over 10 to 15,000 stray dogs a year. The numbers are amazing. Right. And 72% of them are found within a mile of their home. And of that percentage, more than half of those are found within 400 yards of their home. Right. So when you see a stray dog in your neighborhood, that dog lives really close by. Chances are that dog lives close by. You probably know that dog. And instead of calling animal control to have them come pick it up, approach the dog, see if it's safe to put a leash on them, walk them around the neighborhood, see if anyone knows who it is, posting flyers, going on to Nextdoor, going on to Facebook and trying to identify who the owner is, calling it into animal control and saying, hey, I found this dog. I'm going to do A, B, and C. Has anyone called in a loss report? Things like that are going to make animal control trust the community a lot more. And a lot more agencies are doing this and moving towards that. It's really great to see. I love it. I love it.
It's exciting. I think another point that's really interesting a way to look at this differently. There's communities all across the country that have been figuring out how to solve the problems for their community's dogs and cats on their own without any help from us for decades already, right? We know this, right? No matter where you work, there's a community that their only relationship to the local animal welfare community, sadly, is punitive, right? When Scott or people like, animal
I got you.
show up for bad news, right? And we know this, that there's communities where they're not typically in the pipeline to adopt, they're not typically in the pipeline to volunteer, they're left out, right? They aren't plugged in, but they've been solving their problems where, Uncle Jimmy is going into the hospital and he needs someone to take his dog that he loves, and his neighbor knows someone at the church who says, okay, I'll watch the dog, or the dog gets sick and they can't have money. So, they go down to the local VFW and everyone gets together and they collect money and they figure out how to pay for the dog's health issues, or someone's looking for a dog, or a cat, they post it, and to me, there's communities that are already doing community-centered sheltering because we haven't been there for them already. And this isn't a knock on us. Again, it comes back to that point, is animal welfare as an entity has been burdened with solving all the problems for cats and dogs. So because that's impossible to do, some communities have been left out. And we can look to them. There's already an existing model. I know where I grew up in inner city in Boston, where no one called the shelter animal control. When I couldn't find my dog Spike, I went up and down the block and I went to the gym and the boxing club and the local tavern. And I said, hey, anyone seen Spike? And someone's auntie's, uncle's, cousin's nephew found him and I got him back, right? And so there's communities that have this almost internal commerce, this internal network of comms, et cetera, that are already doing this, right? And I think it may not be that sophisticated. It may not have a PowerPoint. It may not have a budget, but they're still solving their problems. And in many cases, the communities that are the most underserved, this goes way beyond animal welfare. It goes to childcare and healthcare and kind of food justice, all these different things. Communities that have been forgotten have been forced to solve their own problems to the best of their ability without help, right? And I think that we need to look to that model. And I think that's what you're talking about. I think of one quick example I think of is in Jacksonville, my friend, I don't know if she's on here, but Denise Deisler at Jacksonville Humane, ever since I've met her, she's been constantly community, how do we get the community? And it's not always been perfect. She'll be the first one to tell you. It wasn't always great. And she probably still, there's moments where it's less than ideal, but the effort and commitment to making the community a partner is always there. And it ebbs and flows. There's moments where it feels good, there's moments where it doesn't, but there's a commitment to it. And to me, the commitment is the important piece. And I think looking to the community to solve their own problems. And we have to trust the community more than we do, and also not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, a phrase we all talk about, that every pet isn't going to live like my dog does, eat the best food, sleep on a couch, and live in the lap of luxury. We have to learn to be okay with that because, and we all know this, because life in a shelter sucks too.
Yeah.
No matter how much we try to make it good, it's still not ideal. So we have to also be willing to kind of be okay with things that are less than ideal.
And Kenny, you bring up a point when you talk about letting the community solve their own problem. My take on it is that the officer can actually be interjected into that community as part of the community as a resource, rather than the punitive side of it. Because you said something that triggered in my head. It's the only time people really run into an animal control officer is when something bad is happening. Right? So it's always a negative interaction, or at least it's based off of a negative interaction. One of the things that I talk to almost every group I work with, and one of the core tenets of the training that we provide is having the officer going into those communities and meeting the people in positive settings. One of the things that I implemented when I was running animal control was we called them just dog park visits. Right. So my officers were required to go to obviously priority calls trumped it, but would be required to go to a dog park. Ticket books and all that stuff stayed in the truck. They're not allowed to write a citation or a warning in a dog park. You get out, you get a bag of biscuits and a tennis ball, and you go out and you just talk to the people. And and I always said to the officers, I don't want them to meet Officer Lamberti. I want them to meet Kenny. You know, because Kenny's a good guy, and he's there. You know, he's there. He's tossing a tennis ball. Yeah, I know. You know, we're talking to a group of people here, so I got to be nice. You know, but they're giving out dog biscuits. They're meeting the dog. They're meeting the people. They're meeting them on a positive plane. You know, there's nothing negative happening, and having that interaction builds those relationships and gives them the opportunity to identify a few things. One is like, what's going on in the community? Well, Scott is having trouble. He hasn't been feeling well lately, and he's been having trouble keeping his dog, in the yard, or, he lost his job because of COVID or whatever, and he's having trouble feeding his dog. Oh, I got plenty of dog food in my truck. Why don't I, I'll go over and drop off some food, or, hey, I'm a carpenter, and I'd love to help build, that doghouse. And, that comes back to the story that you had mentioned earlier. When I was an officer in Boston, I had a kid who loved his dog, and he wanted to keep his dog, but he didn't have a shelter. It was just a piece of plywood propped up against a fence. And I went over to a place where a house was being built, and I asked the contractors just if I could have some spare lumber, because I was going to help the kid build a doghouse. By the time I left there, when I told them why I wanted the spare lumber, I had a team of guys going over there, and they built this dog a fantastic house. The guy gave me his card and said, "Hey, if you ever need any more help like this, please call me. I'll be happy to send a group of guys over there with some wood to build it." Those opportunities exist, and all we got to do is ask for it. But we don't, because we're so busy running around trying to put out fires, trying to clear our call logs, and we don't get the opportunity to do anything proactive. You can call it proactive or positive or whatever, but that's one of the biggest struggles we have, is having that opportunity. But if we just take the time to stop at a dog park or go to one of the neighborhood community meetings, and one of the questions that was up here was, how do we do it in today, since we can't do face-to-face because of today's environment? Next door, Facebook. I know so many ACOs out there who have started their own Facebook account under like Officer Giacoppo or Officer Lamberti, and they engage the community that way. And so it's being creative. It's being out on social media and getting those positive engagements, which really starts the process from the animal control side. Now we have the citizen side, where they're being proactive and reaching out to City Hall or reaching out to the shelter and saying, hey, I got, what can I do to help? What can I do to help solve the problems that you're facing? And that's why I applaud places like Charlotte and Pasco in particular, that are utilizing people in the community who want to help, not just be volunteers and fosters, but actually in the field working with the problems we're facing in the communities.
Yeah, I think we'd be remiss not to address the COVID issue, right? And that's something my team has done a lot of work on. What we're teaching people, and I know it was put in the link, but if you go to bestfriends.org/action team, you put in a couple, like your email and your name, I think, your zip code, and you'll be in. We built a toolkit. And one of the things that we built this before COVID, and it turned out to be really useful, is every person has a sphere of influence. I'm personally not even on Facebook, right? For my own just personal choice I made. But, if you have children in a school, if you belong to a faith-based organization, if you belong to a CrossFit gym or a book club, or, you're on Nextdoor, or you're on a neighborhood committee, or you're, however you're engaged, somewhere in your life, you're connected to other people. Right? We all are. We're having to do it in a creative way now. Some of us just every Friday night have a wine enthusiast club. Like, at the end of the day, we're finding ways, even with all the challenges, to find ways to stay connected to people. And what I encourage people to do is to use that sphere of influence, because the one thing we know is, give or take 80%, maybe 78% of households in this country have cats or dogs. And they are the great equalizer. It doesn't matter where you stand politically, religiously, if you live in the North, the South, how old, young, race, gender, whatever things that sadly have begun to kind of divide this country. Cats and dogs bring us together. Cats and dogs are this universal equalizer. So we've been encouraging people to use their sphere of influence to plug into the local animal welfare movement. Just share. Whenever you're in, say, hey, have you checked out our local shelter? They're looking for foster families. Hey, have you seen the local animal control is doing a clinic this weekend? Or the ACOs are doing ride-alongs, or they're giving out pet food bank, or there's a pet food bank. Or here, just share these links about resources that are available for pet owners and try to get them in communities that people need them. So I think specific to COVID, what we're doing is kind of virtual. I'm a community organizer at heart. So COVID has shut down my bread and butter, which is going door to door, teaching people in communities to canvas and build a community force. So we have to be nimble and creative here. And I think using people's sphere of influence, I've seen CrossFit gyms build food banks for pets but they never would have thought of it. And just think of all the people you know, think of how you're connecting to them, and then sharing information and amplifying the local animal welfare messaging, whatever it may be. If you love your shelter, your rescue, or you're volunteering with local municipality, just share that messaging and share those resources far and wide, wherever you're connecting with people. The impact of that is tremendous. And the last thing, I'll hand it back to you, Scott, is we've gotten a bit obsessed with data, right? And I think we have to create new ways to measure the impact of this so we can continue to sustain it and get funding for it. And I think we should be measuring the ambassadors we collect. If I was an animal control, director of animal control, I would make a mandatory part of my weekly reports of my officers that they have to recruit one ambassador in the community. And then they have to cultivate that relationships. If you had 5 officers, if you have 2 officers, and every week they're identifying people they meet while they're out in the community, and they're cultivating and nourishing that relationship, just imagine the relationship, how that will expand over the course of weeks, months, at the end of the year. I think the same thing's true for the local shelter. We should have people whose job, in their job description, is to recruit and cultivate ambassadors from within the community, all parts of the community. The more upwardly mobile, the more underserved, everything in between, because what we know is that dogs and cats are present across all those barriers. So I think we have to measure it, we have to track it, we have to show its impact, and we have to make a commitment to it. If we do that, then we really actually will be doing community-centered sheltering, and we will actually be moving towards the future. And so those are my, kind of close out with that. I know we're running close to the end here, Scott, so I'll leave it to you. I want to make sure if there's people that have questions, we can get to that.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions, Kenny, and thank you for that. One question I wanted to bring up, I wanted to ask here is, if someone is from a community where community-supported work for animals isn't the norm or even considered, how should an advocate approach them? What are some tactics to get started?
Wow, is that for me or is that for you?
Well, I mean, we can both. My first thought is, first of all, I fully see and get that not every community, particularly when I'm speaking on behalf of the municipal agencies aspect of it. Not every municipal agency has embraced that practice, and that there are still some places that are looking at the community through what I call clouded lenses. Like, everyone's the same. I work with so many places that don't want to do adoptions, or their goal is to take animals away from people because people in this neighborhood shouldn't have pets. And they want to get all of the animals out, get them into the shelter, and then transport them to another state. I deal with that all the time, and it's difficult. It's difficult to get them to see, that's not really the case. And I think that they're looking at the community through clouded lenses. But regardless, I want to address the question. It's not easy, and sometimes you do have communities where the municipal agency isn't going to be the starting point, and it's not going to be the so receptive of this type of mentality or mindset. My suggestion would be, from the community level, is starting to organize things and just letting animal control know that you want them to be a part of it. Like a food bank, a pet food bank. If anyone in the community is going to start a pet food bank, they should reach out to animal control and say, where would you have it? Where do you think it's most needed? Even though you might know that it's needed in this neighborhood, invite them to be part of it. And if they tell you to go jump in a lake, then you try again another time. You don't don't break down. You don't lose that attitude of, I want to work with them. And I know it's frustrating, but I would say just continuously pressing them to be a part of what you're doing. You know, like the people that Kenny's team are building, those groups of people should be inviting animal control regardless of how much they are resistant, because eventually something's going to crack. They're going to hire a new officer, and that officer is going to be like, yeah, I'm into that. And then it's going to grow. And I've seen it. We also have in the chat, I think we've already posted the link to the Humane Animal Control Manual. There are sections in that on community engagement, in particular, the role of animal control, and community engagement strategies and all that, that I would recommend everybody to read and share it with your animal control department. If you're not part of the animal control department, share it with them.
Yeah, I think one quick thing to add that I saw Jenna Diaz I think one thing we overlook is there's already groups organizing, gathering people in every community. They might just not be connected to the animal welfare movement. So YMCA, schools, even social justice groups, and I would tap into them. Like, you don't have to recreate the wheel. Like, if you reach out to non-traditional animal welfare partners, CBOs, which, just in case, community-based organizations. That's what my team does across the country. We try to partner with YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs and faith-based groups and mosques and temples and churches and PTAs. We try to, and even for-profit in one part of Texas, we found someone who owned a bunch of car dealerships who had tremendous influence in the community because they sold cars to everybody and they had billboards everywhere. We said, hey, how do you feel about dogs and cats? And we brought them into the fold. So to me, it doesn't have to just be the traditional animal welfare groups. Right. Reach out to the people and the groups who already have a constituency, and then go to them, because likely many of those people love cats and dogs too and don't want them to die in shelters, don't want them to suffer in communities, and say, hey, we've got these flyers. Will you mind circulating them on Sunday at church? Would you mind putting them on the cars in your lotto, handing them out? In Baltimore, Maryland, I'll give one example. I found a pizza place back in 2013. The guy had a bulldog who hung out behind the counter. With every delivery that went out, he handed out our flyers for the pet program. And that was a tremendous opportunity. So don't be, it's hard. And I also will say, baby steps. You don't have to change the world this week. If you meet two people who are willing to help you circulate your message and recruit other people, you're off to a good start. Turn 2 into 10, turn 10 into 20, and let it build. It doesn't have to be massive. Start slow and just start by talking to people and asking them to talk to other people.
Yeah, and Kenny, looking at that question, it asks about human services and all that. I don't want to. I think we would be remiss to not include domestic violence. Talking to the domestic violence groups in your community, as well as like child and family services. Those are the types of services that, from an enforcement perspective, we need to be linked up with. We need to partner with the domestic violence groups, the child and family services group, Department of Mental Health. Those are the types of human services that play into the enforcement end of it. And they're critical to being able to solve problems. As well as, when I was in Boston, I was assigned to the Boston Police gang unit. And because of the gang members were, they all had pit bulls, they were engaged in dog fighting, and but not all of them were engaged in it. And it was a situation where, some people, might have been caught up in gangs for the wrong reasons, but they did love their animals. And I worked really closely with Gang Peace. I mean, that's a pretty non-traditional organization for us to be working with. But thinking along the lines of what problems are you facing in your community? What problems do you see in your community? And who else is dealing with those? And looking at it from from outside the box, I guess, or
we've got to be willing to be creative. And it's funny, Scott, I won't go down there, but I actually was an organizer for Bolton, which is funny. But what I'll say is, in Philadelphia, we simply partnered with a social work agency, and they had laminated cards that they handed out to thousands of clients. At the time, I was working in Philadelphia. At the time, was the poorest zip code in the country. And we just asked, they shared our information on their card. That's all. They had this laminated card that had for substance abuse, for domestic, all these things. And we said, hey, are you comfortable sharing our information on there for people who need help with their pets? And that all it took, that we established that relationship over coffee. So I think like reach out to anywhere people are connecting to people. And I also want to say this isn't just about poverty, because there's a tremendous opportunity to meet people and more upwardly mobile too. People across all these barriers are a force that can help us. They are our bandwidth if we make the effort to connect with them. And we just have to get out there and start building the relationships.
Well, Kenny, we are out of time. So I want to, thanks for having this conversation with me tonight. And if there were questions that were unanswered, we'll do our best to get them answered. I know they're documented somehow on the back end, and we'll get copies of those, and we'll do our best to answer them. But with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it. And stay safe out there and be well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.